Thanks very much. I'd like to open to the audience questions. Please raise your hands. We have folks coming around with mics. A couple of requests. One, we are recording this, as you probably know. If you would, when you ask your question, identify yourselves. Ask your question and make sure you're asking a question rather than necessarily giving us a speech. If you do, we will take the microphone away. So please, yes.
Okay, hi. Andy Hoffman at the University of Michigan. I'd like to ask two questions that I think are going to be undercurrents for the next 2 days. One is the differentiation between disinformation and misinformation. When is it intended? When is it on purpose? And my question is for Laura and perhaps the rest, but when do you call out something as a lie versus a myth? And for the others, are there dangers to doing that? That's question one. Question two, I want to be equal opportunity. So I want to flip this on the other side. When do we call out when science oversteps? When science assumes it has all the answers and is, by ideology, dismissive of religion, the humanities, things like that. Certainly scientism is real, and that creates a lot of animosity coming back at us and trying to communicate science.
Yeah, so to take the first one, this is a big subject of debate within the newsroom. We're very reluctant to use the word lie because it implies intention. And so we have to use all these other words like falsehood, we wouldn't say misstatement, mostly falsehood is what we go with, which is very frustrating to headline writers because lie is just 3 little letters. And you can put so much else in the headline or the Facebook feed or the Twitter tweet or whatever. So yeah, we're very reluctant to call a lie a lie. There's a lot of pressure within the newsroom to use that word. Especially in headlines, we've seen sort of a very slow evolution of newspapers from the former very kind of understated headlines to finally saying when something's not true. So at the beginning of the Trump administration, we would say Trump says X, Y, and Z. And now we've gotten much better about saying Trump says falsely X, Y, and Z in the headline, because a lot of times people only see the headline. It was a little bit too little too late, and we're still trying to keep up with the escalation of misinformation.
If I could just jump in on the misinformation, disinformation front, there are a lot of difficulties there in discerning intent. I mean, I don't know what's going on in the heads of those apricot seed folks. Are they lying in the sense that they know that they're telling an untruth? Or do they really believe this stuff? And I think actually sometimes even where there are clear disinformation campaigns, some people in the campaign believe it and pass it on, and others know it's not true, and they're originating it, and they're pushing it, and they're trying to game stuff. And then there may be people who actually believe the misinformation but are manipulating the algorithms and so on. So, as a tactic, I mean, we can talk about disinformation campaigns where there are explicit efforts. We could talk about misinformation campaigns where true believers are pushing the information out. I'm not sure how productive it is actually to really delve into intent as compared to both the content as well as the means of dissemination. As a communication issue, I don't know, like when one calls a lie, because that's, again, there may be times you're like, actually, this person really knows what they're saying is untrue. That's actually a useful thing to report as a news reporter, to say, actually, we found depositions and they knew what they were doing and they said something different. That's actually important in some contexts, obviously. So, Dominique?
Yeah, I wanted to actually, does it work?
Yeah.
I wanted to tackle, Andrew, thank you for this question, because I think we don't address that enough. Like the idea that scientists may be overstepping and actually, like using to some extent the authority that's conferred to them by their credential as us in this. Are we the best to talk about this? Well, hopefully if we could also include someone that is part of those debates at the community level and has to deal with this would be another issue, right? So like I think very often we overstep. I'm sure we all have, maybe not recognizing that, something that's also called lay knowledge at the community level may be as important as scientific expertise when we talk about these issues. And I think the danger of overstepping and claiming that scientific authority gives you the right to actually discredit people's concerns based on other approaches that are not pure science, that may be religious, that may be anything you want, you know, it's actually very dangerous because it makes feel like, you know, people that indeed, like going back to my point about acknowledge, accommodating, refuting, that we don't take people seriously. Look, scientists are public, are people as well, and I think we need to really think it through. When should we stop using our authority to step out in debates that certainly don't have only a science side?
Great, let's take a different question. Over here on the right-hand side. Do we have somebody on the right-hand side? Okay.
Okay. Monica Feliu, Mujer Ciencia Puerto Rico, and I Biology. My question is specific for Judith Cox from the World Science Festival. You mentioned that you make sure that you have, you know, the top scientists and diverse perspectives on stage, but watching this video, I was really struck by how few people of color were on stage. And the few that I saw were students or participants of the festival. And so in the context of Vish's earlier talk, my question is, what are you doing to engage these hardly reached audiences? And more importantly, how are you making sure that these audiences can see themselves in science by who you're bringing on stage and the perspectives that you're valuing by putting them on stage?
And excellent questions, really. It's a very important topic, and it's something that we struggle with both in terms of gender and ethnicity and race. The one thing is in the video, and it's something we should probably look at in terms of how that little sizzle reel is put together. What you don't see there is the multiplicity of programs we have. There are so many of the programs are on a much smaller scale, where we bring together not simply those Nobel laureates, which are and other science investigators who are leading certain discoveries that are part of the news stories that we're trying to investigate, but also the range of university faculty and other thinkers and commentators more locally, program that we call salons, and that we probably have twice as many of those as we have of the main stage programs, where there is a great deal more diversity and more reflective of the community in which these programs are being presented. And in terms of working with schools and working with student teachers and educators, we work very closely with the Department of Education and other after-school programs in New York, for example, where we try to build programs that attract communities that are less served by science. We have a program called City of Science that goes to all 5 boroughs around the year. And so the participants, what we're really trying to do is build, as many other festivals are, build a connection to communities and a pipeline where people are, younger students, younger audiences are being exposed to science, encouraged to think of it as something they could do, and that's where broadening our audience and getting a more representative community is, most of our focus is there. On the main stage programs, we need to do better, and we also need to recognize the fact that historically that has not been the case. And so by definition, if you're looking at gravitational waves, it has been pretty much the domain of a certain level of high-level physicists, most of whom are white men. But we make every effort, and it's something that's very important to us.
Thanks. So to the right, please.
It was mentioned that authoritative and unexpected sources are the most helpful for refuting misinformation. Can you hear me? And an example of the authoritative source was the CDC. But my colleagues and I have been wondering, how does the public come to know what scientific institutions are and how they work? And why is an international panel on climate change more authoritative than some other person? And given that we also sometimes we'll hear about scientific misconduct, individual scientists who are committing fraud or whatnot. How do we differentiate between what a scientist says, which may not be authoritative, and what an institution or a collection of scientists say, which has built in all these sort of corrective, self-corrective mechanisms?
I can say something briefly. So I think your point is an important one. So sometimes we assume the CDC is authoritative, but lots of people distrust the federal government. The CDC is part of the federal government, so we shouldn't assume it's most authoritative. There's interesting research suggesting that people find the military's concern about climate change to be very effective. So that's an example of an unexpected and authoritative source that one might appeal to. So I guess I would suggest that there may be ways to be more creative. Similarly, it could be the case if you're talking about climate, that the scientists at the university that has a popular football team would be more authoritative, those climate scientists, than some far-off international body. So I think we could think more carefully about who the right sources are.
And I think also what gets more complicated is because it depends of who you are talking to and what issue you are, talking about. I mean, we did some research on how people interpret data and the visualizing data and attributing the source of the data to different institutions. We were talking about nuclear energy waste and so on. Same data, same display, depending of the type of, like graph you do, attributed to the Department of Energy or attributed to the MIT was trusted differently. So exactly for that specific nuclear energy related display of data, MIT had a better source. For another source, maybe the DOE would be. So that's what gets complicated. It's like we just really have to avoid making generalization across institutions.
And I'd also just very briefly note, it's very easy to fake authority. So like the apricot pit example was like Dr. So-and-so says blah, blah, blah. This was a guy who, had an honorary degree from a defunct biblical college, right? And that was what made him a doctor, right? I mean, we've written about fake news. All of that is around taking the signals of, it looks like a legitimate, the Denver Guardian, they say that. It doesn't exist, right? But it's very easy to put up a website that looks authoritative. You could have something from the Institutes for Disease Control. That sounds authoritative, right? And it has a beautiful emblem. And so this is also a real challenge. People in this room probably can navigate this pretty well, but the median person not so well.
Yeah, I just want to say that people are much smarter than we think they are.
That's true.
And they do figure these things out. I mean, and not on the esoteric subjects, maybe nuclear energy or physics or whatever it is, but when it comes to their lives, day-to-day lives, and how science influences their day-to-day lives, they're pretty smart. They have to be smart to really navigate the realities of their lives, right? They do figure out who they should go to, who they should talk to, what kind of cues and rules of thumb that they should use to really navigate through this system. Of course, I think we can get really apoplectic about, oh my God, they are not able to follow the scientific principles and they're getting confused. But actually, when it comes to issues that affect them in day-to-day, they do figure it out. Take vaccines as an example. As I said, I was a member of the National Vaccine Advisory Committee, so this has been a real issue for us. I chaired the Vaccine Confidence Working Group looking at this data. If you look at the data, from CDC, Ann Schuchert was giving us the data, 85 to 93% of the parents are still vaccinating their kids, right? So there are a group of parents who are called fence-sitters who have questions. They're not able to decide whether they are good or bad, but they're still vaccinating their kids. So it is this small percentage of people, anywhere from 0 to 10, 12, depending upon the type of vaccination, who are not doing it, right? So we can get too worried about this and say that somehow people are being duped. I still worry about this 12% or 8% or 7%, depending on the numbers, who are not vaccinating their kids. I'm not saying we should not focus them, but the point I want to say is, if you are a parent, you should definitely have questions about this vaccination or anything that is administered to your child. Of course you should have questions, but they're still getting them vaccinated. So all I'm trying to say is that they go to their pediatricians, we found, and they're asking those questions and getting the job done, right? So I think people are much smarter. They do figure it out. Unless it is a very esoteric topic, then we are in trouble, yes. But No, so.
I'd like to introduce you to my brother-in-law.
He may be a part of the 7%.
He may, yeah, indeed.
Remember, this is being recorded.
Indeed. He doesn't know how to use the internet. He'll never access it. All right, another question. Let's see. Back in the corner, please.
Hello, my name is Alberto Taroca. My nonprofit publishes the website minoritypostdoc.org. I have a comment leading to a question. First, I'd like to thank the speaker from Harvard, specifically to including the discussions about diversity and inclusion. I've been following this conference for 4 renditions, and I don't remember the topic being as explicitly or eloquently addressed as you have, so I appreciate that. My comment more specific to my question is, I'm personally pessimistic about how self-policing is going to work among publishers, since bad actors will always escape the norms, sort of the consequence of freedom of the press. So instead, I'm curious about if there's any discussion among scholars on whether to take a position about tech companies hiding behind the Communication Decency Act to protect themselves from being accountable for their content. I'd like to point out that even the hashtag for this event is being spammed, and yet Twitter is not going to face any consequences. So can the scholars come up and say, look, it's time for these companies to be held accountable for the effects they're having on our democracy?
That strikes me as exactly the sort of thing where those questions can't be answered by science.
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
Those are about our social values. We can tell you, certainly, we can give you lots of empirical analysis of the challenges of misinformation online, but we can also tell you about all the history of the places where the government is policing speech, or when there's strong legal threats against speech that's vulnerable or politically contested, right? If you publish one book in Britain, you're subject to their libel laws, right? And those have been abused to silence people. So it's a complicated, what I would say is it's a complicated thing, and I'm not sure it's one our science can speak to. That's a much broader conversation. You would need people from law and technology and a lot of other fields.
Although the one thing is that science comes from a place, right? It does come from human values and choices in terms of the questions to ask. And so one question I think that is on our shoulders is, actually, there are concerns about democracy today. And that should motivate us to do research in that space. The answer to what to do is not a scientific one, but science should inform that, and the science should be directed towards that.
We have time for one last question, a very quick one, please. Overhead. Yep. Fine.
Laura, you brought up that a lot of the lessons that researchers here have discovered are being used by the disinformation campaigns, as well as people who are trying to teach people about science. So I wonder if people who are studying the science of science communication have any suggestions or believe that there are any things you'll learn by studying the science of science communication that can eventually be used against us as we move forward. It seems like a sort of a losing battle when you're talking about corporations with multi-million-dollar campaigns, whereas we're working with so little. So I guess kind of open to anybody on the floor.
I would say that what we have learned can be used for good or for evil.
Yeah.
Like most things. I think it's a legitimate question. But we are a science of science communication. We have to be open, we have to be transparent, we have to publish, and we have to face the consequences of that. So I want to thank our panelists. What a great way to start the morning.